Imagine packing up an entire modern superstore filled with thousands of tons of supplies, putting it all on the backs of tired donkeys and heavily armored soldiers, and walking across a burning, hostile desert where absolutely nothing grows. That is exactly what Alexander the Great did. Every single day for over a decade. People love to obsess over his brilliant battlefield tactics, the unstoppable Macedonian phalanx, the glorious cavalry charges, the epic conquests. But there is a famous military saying: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Alexander's moving city consisted of roughly 50,000 hungry mouths to feed. Let's do the math. That requires about 75,000 kilograms of wheat. And that is not a one-time delivery. That is every single day. Then there is hydration. They needed over 300,000 liters of water daily, all while marching through the blazing, unforgiving heat of the Middle Eastern environment. If the supply chain failed for even 3 short days, the greatest military force in human history would simply starve to death. So how did they pull off this impossible miracle without trucks, apps, or refrigeration? The answer actually begins before Alexander even took the throne. It started with his brilliant and slightly extreme father. Meet King Philip II of Macedon. He completely revolutionized the army, and his first major target was unexpected. In the ancient world, armies relied heavily on wooden wagons pulled by oxen. They crawled at a miserable 2 miles an hour. Even worse, an ox eats massive amounts of food. On a long march, the ox would literally eat the supplies it was pulling. Philip realized this was a logistical nightmare. So, he made a radical decision. He banned wheeled carts. Instead, the Macedonians switched entirely to pack animals, primarily mules and horses, which were much faster. But there was a catch. Pack animals carry less overall weight than a heavy wagon. So, who was going to carry the rest of the army's equipment? The answer was the soldiers themselves. Philip fired the servants. Now, the infantryman carried his own armor, his long weapons, plus his cooking pots, tent stakes, and up to 30 days' worth of grain rations. In total, a single stick-thin soldier was hauling over 40 pounds of gear while marching through hostile territory. This grueling physical requirement earned them a very famous and highly sarcastic nickname: Philip's Mules. It sounds like pure torture. But this brutal reform gave the Macedonian army unmatched, terrifying speed. Without clunky wagons getting stuck, Alexander's army could march 20 miles a day, catching every enemy completely off guard. But there was still a huge problem. Carrying bags of raw wheat is fine, but you can't exactly eat it raw. So they figured out the grain. But an army needs protein to fight, and carrying fresh meat through a scorching desert without modern refrigeration is a guaranteed recipe for food poisoning. To prevent their supplies from rotting away, the Macedonians relied heavily on massive amounts of salt. Meat was aggressively dry-cured, turning it into tough, salty leather that could last for months. You practically needed a hammer to eat it. They also constantly foraged and hunted along the march, chasing down anything that moved to supplement their diets. But food wasn't their deadliest enemy. The real mass murderer was something they couldn't even see. Water sources on a military campaign were often stagnant, muddy, and completely contaminated by thousands of men and animals. In the ancient world, waterborne diseases like dysentery killed vastly more soldiers than enemy swords ever did. If 50,000 men drank from a bad river, the entire campaign would literally flush itself down the drain in a week. Their ingenious and highly popular solution? Wine. Greeks rarely drank their wine straight. Ancient wine was exceptionally thick, syrupy, and highly alcoholic. Instead, they mixed it directly into their dirty drinking water supplies. The alcohol content acted as an ancient sanitizer, effectively neutralizing the deadly bacteria. It wasn't perfect science, but it kept the army hydrated, relatively healthy, and significantly happier. But even with salt and wine, you cannot physically carry enough food from Greece to conquer Asia. They needed a new strategy. So if carrying enough food from Greece was impossible, what was his master plan? Simple. He didn't bring the food to his army, he brought his army to the food. His strategy relied heavily on a logistical concept known as surrender supply. Weeks before his massive army ever arrived at a new territory, Alexander would send envoys ahead. These messengers would approach the local Persian governors, known as satraps, and hand them a ridiculously long grocery list for 50,000 men and horses. The deal was basically this: Alexander is coming. If you have this food waiting for us in a depot, we will take it, pay you fairly, and peacefully march right through your lands without hurting anyone. For the local governor, this was a stressful but simple math problem. Providing massive stockpiles of wheat at these prearranged depots was expensive, but saying no to Alexander was far more expensive. The army would just grab the food like a modern drive-through and keep moving. But what if a city refused? If they didn't provide logistics, they weren't just an inconvenience, they were a direct threat to the army's survival. And Alexander did not take threats lightly. He would immediately stop, lay siege to the city, and completely destroy it to the ground. He would take the food anyway. Word spread quickly. It was much cheaper to just feed him. But what happens when the land runs out? Even with local surrender supply, there is a hard mathematical limit to how far you can march inland. To completely bypass this bottleneck, Alexander turned his eyes to the sea. He assembled a massive fleet of merchant cargo ships, commanded by his trusted friend, Admiral Nearchus. Think of these ships as ancient, floating super trucks. A single standard merchant ship could carry as much grain as roughly 500 heavily loaded pack mules. And the best part? Mules eat your cargo along the way. A wooden ship consumes exactly 0 rations. Every grain loaded on board reaches its destination. The strategy was brilliant. The army would march down the coastline, hugging the sea. Meanwhile, Nearchus's fleet would sail parallel to them, acting as a giant, floating supermarket. Every few days, the ships would pull into a designated bay and offload mountains of supplies onto the beach. It was basically the ancient world's version of Amazon Prime next-day delivery. This perfect land and sea synchronization allowed the Macedonians to push further east than any Western army before them. The men were fed, the horses were healthy, and the conquest seemed unstoppable. But this flawless system had one fatal flaw. It only worked if you stayed near the water. When we picture Alexander's army, we imagine 50,000 disciplined soldiers marching in perfect unison. But trailing right behind the shiny spears was a massive, chaotic, walking city of non-combatants. Historians estimate that for every fighting soldier, there was at least half a civilian, sometimes a 1-to-1 ratio. Who were they? First, families. Since the campaign lasted over a decade, soldiers took local wives and raised children on the march. Second, merchants and traders. They followed the army like vultures, creating a booming mobile economy. A soldier might loot a priceless Persian crown in battle, only to trade it to a camp merchant later that evening for a fresh loaf of bread. The camp also housed blacksmiths to fix bent spears, and doctors to pull arrows out of lungs. Every night, this massive, sprawling circus would set up camp in a highly organized grid. King Philip had actually banned women from his camps to keep the army fast. But Alexander completely reversed this rule. He knew that a soldier fights 10 times harder when his wife and kids are literally standing right behind the battlefield. But wait a minute. Doesn't adding 30,000 civilians mean vastly more mouths to feed? Yes. However, it was actually a genius trade-off. The camp followers took over the heavy lifting. They foraged for extra food, repaired armor, and boiled that rock-hard salted meat so the soldiers could just focus on fighting. Together, this massive 80,000-person entity moved across Asia like a living, breathing, hungry organism. And that exact organism was about to walk straight into the deadliest environment on Earth, the Gedrosian Desert. In 325 BC, Alexander made the most controversial decision of his life. He marched his entire army into the Gedrosian Desert. The plan was for Nearchus's fleet to keep delivering food, but towering coastal mountains forced the land army to detour inland. For the first time in a decade, the floating supermarket was gone. They were completely on their own. Within days, the grain ran out. The soldiers became so hungry, they started looking at Philip's mules as dinner. Men would secretly slaughter the pack animals, eat them raw, and tell the officers the beasts died of heat stroke. But hunger was secondary. Thirst was the real killer. The heat was so intense, men drank their own sweat. According to legend, a scouting party found a tiny puddle of water. They collected it in a helmet and offered it to Alexander. Knowing there wasn't enough for everyone, Alexander refused to drink. He poured it into the burning sand. If his men suffered, he suffered. To avoid the sun, they started marching and sleeping at night. One evening, the camp followers set up in a dry riverbed. It hadn't rained where they were. But miles away in the mountains, a sudden storm broke. A massive flash flood ripped through the canyon in the dark, washing away most of the camp followers, their tents, and their remaining supplies. For 60 grueling days, the march continued. It was a logistical nightmare that no amount of genius could fix. When they finally staggered out of the wasteland and reached civilization, they looked like an army of walking skeletons. Historians estimate that at least a quarter of the entire force perished. More people died in the desert than in any battle Alexander ever fought. It was a brutal, humbling lesson. The greatest conqueror in the world wasn't defeated by men. He was defeated by logistics. Alexander the Great is remembered as a military genius who never lost a battle. But his true superpower wasn't his sword. It was his spreadsheet. By completely rewriting the rules of how an army carries its gear, preserves its food, and sources its water, he managed to conquer 5.2 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface in just 13 years. And the rest of the ancient world was watching very closely, especially a rising power in the West. The Romans took Alexander's logistical blueprint and perfected it. They banned slow ox carts and made their own soldiers carry so much gear that they were nicknamed Marius's Mules. King Philip and Alexander didn't just build an army. They built the ancient world's most advanced delivery company. A company powered by sweating mules, heavily burdened soldiers, salt-cured meat, and wine-purified water. So the next time you hear about a great military victory, remember the golden rule of history. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And if you want to feed your brain with more history without having to carry 40 pounds of gear, hit that subscribe button and join the empire. No walking across deserts required, unless you are a mule. In that case, run. See you next time on Greek Empire Stories.